Today's session on hormones and homeostasis. Today we'll be talking about what homeostasis is, very briefly, thermoregulation strategies, that's how we keep the body warm, osmoregulation, how do we control the amount of water present using the kidneys, and how hormones play a role in that. Homeostasis, remember, is the maintenance of internal body conditions. It's an attribute of all living things, despite fluctuations in the external environment, maintaining those conditions and keeping them the same. So thermoregulation, keeping the temperature the same, osmoregulation, keeping the amount of water and solutes the same, and excretion, disposing nitrogen-containing wastes, are all critical parts of homeostasis and parts we're going to talk about today. In thermoregulation, so heat regulation, there's obviously numerous ways that an organism can gain or lose heat to its environment. Convection, radiation, evaporation, and conduction are all really important for living organisms to help them to maintain internal body temperature. There's 5 ways that organisms promote thermoregulation. They enable their bodies to control temperature. The first is increasing metabolic heat production. So metabolism releases heat. So by changing the rate of metabolism, we can create more heat in our bodies. That's particularly true of endotherms, such as mammals and birds. You probably know them as being warm-blooded organisms. Warm-blooded organisms are able to regulate their internal body temperature more closely using metabolic heat production. So we can do that. Organisms can also shiver. Rapid muscular contraction is going to release heat too, increase physical activity as well. One thing, for example, that honeybees do is they gather together in tight groups, and they will shiver effectively, vibrating their wings and generating heat too. Next one, insulation. So obviously hair, feathers, and fat layers provide great insulation, and I guess for humans, we have a behavioral adaptation of putting clothes on too, which can take the role of some of those things. Depending on where an organism lives, obviously, and the temperature of its environment makes a big difference in these things, but these all provide ways of reducing heat loss. Hairs in particular trap a layer of warm air next to the skin that reduces the temperature gradient between the skin and the outside air, and so you get less heat diffusing out of the body. There's also circulatory adaptations. So we can increase or decrease our blood flow next to the skin. In particularly cold weather, less blood is pumped to the surface of the skin, which is why cold people are often associated with having paler skin. And that is to keep our internal organs warm. Then counter to that, on a hot day, the capillaries in our bloodstream expand. This is called vasodilation. And when we get vasodilation, more blood flows to the surface, which allows us to lose heat from the surface of our skin more easily, and so control our internal body temperature. The opposite of that, when the blood flow is constricted, is called vasoconstriction. Okay. We can also do countercurrent heat exchange, and I'll show you a nice example of that in a moment. Another one, evaporative cooling. So this is a big one for humans. Obviously, sweating enables, because of the properties of water, we can lose a large amount of energy when we sweat, and we can lose a large amount of heat energy because of the high heat of vaporization required for water to evaporate from the surface of our skin. So when it does evaporate, it carries a lot of energy with it, and that helps to cool us down. Other mammals that have a large amount of fur instead can pant, and this is true for other organisms too. It's the same thing, evaporation from the surface, carrying heat away from the body, and cooling the body down. And then, of course, there are behavioral responses, and these are very significant. These are used by endotherms and ectotherms, ectotherms being cold-blooded organisms. And these are behavioral adaptations that enable an organism to control its internal body temperature. So moving towards the sun or moving towards the shade, depending on whether an organism is too hot or too cold. Okay, think about reptiles in particular. in order to get their body temperature up, they will bask in the sun, they will lie out in the sun, so that's why you see lizards on rocks, for example, trying to warm themselves up so that they have enough energy to go about the day. Endotherms have got the advantage of, because they control their own internal body temperature more, they are able to be active at other times of the day, so that gives us an advantage in being able to be active not just during the warmest part of the day. We're able to be active in the evenings and at night as well. The trade-off for that is being an endotherm is much more energy intensive. If you have had a pet reptile, you know you don't need to feed it very often because they're very energy efficient, because they're producing less heat energy, so they're losing a huge amount less energy than an endotherm would, a warm-blooded organism. So there's this trade-off between being able to be active a lot, but having to get a lot of food to support that, and these are two evolutionary tactics, if you like. Migration, of course, is also important. Seasonal migrations and bathing. Organisms can bathe in water to cool themselves down. So elephants, for example, they do evaporative heat transfer. They have these enormous ears that helps to keep them cool. And this was an example of the heat exchange mechanisms that I was talking about. So Canada geese, for example, have heat exchange mechanisms in their blood. So basically the blood going in the arteries is able to re-warm the blood in the veins as it returns to the body. That means that you're not getting geese is not getting, the goose rather, is not getting really cold blood going back into its body and cooling it down too much. Same with dolphins' fins. We often see this countercurrent mechanism where the warmer blood that's going out is actually used to partially cool the blood coming back. So another important aspect of homeostasis is osmoregulation, controlling the amount of water and solutes present in the blood. And we're going to talk about that and excretion of nitrogenous waste. Nitrogenous waste such as ammonia is produced by the body. Ammonia in the breakdown of proteins. Ammonia is poisonous, but it's very soluble in water. So aquatic animals that are exposed to a lot of water don't have to do anything particularly special with ammonia. They can just release it. So fish produce ammonia and they just pee ammonia, essentially. It's not a problem for them because they have so much water that they can easily flush it out of their system. For us, as mammals, we don't have as much water in our environment, so we can't afford to lose as much water in disposing of our nitrogenous waste. As a result, the concentrations of ammonia would be so high that they would be toxic to us. We change the ammonia into urea. Urea is less toxic, easier to store, and then the most extreme kind of end of what we do with our nitrogenous waste, I guess, is some land animals and birds in particular excrete uric acid. Uric acid is virtually dry, and you may be familiar with uric acid because it is a large constituent of bird poop. So if a bird has pooped on your car, there's a lot of uric acid, right? They don't pee. Think about the fact that birds are not able to carry a large amount of extra water, and so it's virtually dry waste. This is waste. It's an evolutionary advantage because, of course, then they're able to move and live in areas where there's less water. Urea and uric acid, though, again, it's one of these trade-offs, take energy to produce. So the trade-off there. So most aquatic animals, including fishes, as you can see, produce ammonia. Mammals, amphibians, sharks, and some bony fishes produce urea. And then the birds, many other reptiles, insects, land snails, etc., produce uric acid crystals. I think it's interesting to think about their proximity to water and how they have evolved to deal with that. So the excretory system is really important. Our bodies produce waste, and we need to be able to excrete it. Do not confuse excretion with egestion. Egestion is pooing, effectively, for humans. Excretion is the removal of materials that were inside our cells and inside our bloodstream, inside our bodies. So it expels waste, it regulates the water, and regulates ion content. And this is done through nephrons. These are tiny tubes, the functional units within the kidneys. They remove filtrate from the blood and then they refine the filtrate to produce urine. We have selective reabsorption back into the blood of the things that we need to keep. The urine, ureters drain the kidneys, they go down into the bladder, and then they go out through the urethra. So a bit of a kind of location on this. If you put your hands on your hips, where your thumbs end up, just round behind your back, and that's the approximate location of your kidneys. Okay, we have a renal artery and vein that goes to each kidney, and you have two kidneys. This is very important. You can tell that their job is very important because you have two of them. If one of them fails, the other one is able to act. Obviously, a kidney transplant is one of our most common forms of organ transplant because kidneys can be damaged relatively easily. A kidney transplant, we have to find a matching donor, and there can be rejection responses, which can be problematic. So the kidneys are then going to drain their filtrate down into the ureter, down through the ureter to the urinary bladder, and then it'll eventually pass out when we pee through our urethra. Just a note, I remember this in that it's the urine trickles down the ureter, but the urinary bladder is where we often will get bladder stones, and if you're going to have a bladder stone removed, what they'll do is they'll put a small device up your urethra into the bladder and break up the bladder stone. Which can be painful, hence why it's urethra. So ureter is where the urine drips down into the bladder. Urethra is the tube that connects the bladder to the outside world. Okay, so let's look at the kidney. The kidney is made up of various parts. We've got the cortex. Cortex is a big C shape, which is very helpful because of its name. Cortex is around the outside, and then we have these units within that, these folds, that kind of look like lobes. These lobes are called medulla, and I think they kind of look like an M shape. So the cortex is around the outside, and then you've got the medulla on the inside. We've got the renal pelvis, which is where the urine's going to collect, and then it's going to trickle down, as I said, down the ureter. So let's look more closely at the cortex and medulla. The cortex itself has what's known as a Bowman's, thousands and thousands of Bowman's capsules in it, and the start of these tubules. Then we have a long loop that goes down, down, down into the medulla. This is called the loop of Henle. It comes down and then back up, round, and then down the collecting duct. The multiple tubules will feed into the same connecting duct, which will drain the urine down into the renal pelvis. So what happens here? So the first thing to see really is right around here, this section called the glomerulus and the Bowman's capsule. The glomerulus is the blood vessels inside the Bowman's capsule. What happens is the blood passes into the Bowman's capsule, into this glomerulus region, and it's filtered under very high pressure so that most of the molecules move out into the tubule. Some larger parts, so a very small amount of the water, proteins that are present, and any blood cells that are present are too large to be filtered out into the tubule, and so they will continue down through the bloodstream. Now that's fine because those are things that we want to keep in the blood. Things that will pass out will include amino acids, urea, water, and a lot of mineral ions. So those will pass out into the tubule. Now, obviously, we want some of those. We want some of the mineral ions back. There'll be sugar in there too. We want the sugar back, the glucose. We want lots of the amino acids back. We want a lot of that stuff back in our blood. We don't want to lose it in the urine. So we then need to do selective reabsorption. So the proximal tubule, the distal tubule, and the loop of Henle work to regulate that process. Let's just move on. We can see some of the detail. So this is just spread out so that you can see it more clearly. In the proximal tubule, nutrients, some water, some mineral ions reabsorbed back in, and some other drugs and poisons will be pumped into the tubule. So we are able to pump a few more things in. Then in the loop of Henle, we see a couple of things happening. Water is being pumped, is moving out of the loop of Henle by osmosis. You'll notice that in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, salt is being pumped out, And that salt is causing the water in the descending lane to also move out. Okay, so this will be active transport right here, and then the water follows it by osmosis. Then we have more selective reabsorption in the distal tubule and excretion of waste before the urine passes into the collecting duct. So we've collected back in a large number of the things like the amino acids. We've collected back in a lot of the glucose by active transport, moving it back into the body, because it's important not that we don't lose that. Interestingly, if you have diabetes, one of the symptoms is that you have sugary urine, because your body is trying so desperately to get rid of the glucose that it actually uses the kidneys to do that. When my dad was a doctor in Malaysia, one of the diagnoses for diabetes, you could ask someone, is, do they have ants in their toilet? Because that's a sign that there's glucose in the urine. The urine then passes down the collecting duct, and this is kind of the body's last chance to collect back any water that it needs to back out of the blood. And we'll talk about how that is regulated in a moment. An interesting thing with the loop of Henle is the fact that it has varying lengths in different species. I think this is a really nice evolutionary adaptation that we can think about. Beavers have a very short loop of Henle. So they are, and so that's because they don't need to reabsorb much water. Humans, our loop of Henle is a little bit longer, and probably the most extreme version of a loop of Henle is the kangaroo rat. Kangaroo rats live in deserts. Amazingly, they don't actually need to drink any water in order to survive. They're able to, you may remember from respiration, that respiration produces water in that process. So they get all the water they need from their food. This means they have very, very, very little water. They can lose very little water to their surroundings in order to survive. So the kangaroo rat has evolved a very long loop of Henle in order to reabsorb as much water as possible. So for context, the urine then is going to pass down the ureter, remember, be stored in the bladder before it passes out the urethra. So this process is controlled by hormones. Think about it, if you drink a large amount of water, you've got too much water in your body, you're going to need to remove some of that water. Conversely, if you haven't drunk for a while, you need to reduce the amount of water you're losing. This is interesting, we can compare urine between the winter and the summer. Urine in the summer tends to be a lot darker in color. The reason for that is that we are losing more water by evaporation, and so we don't tend to lose as much water in our urine. Okay, in winter, when it's cooler, we lose less water by evaporation, and so urine tends to be more dilute because it's got more water in it. So this is controlled, like a lot of things, by hormones. I just want to quickly spiral back and talk about what hormones are and how they work. Hormones, remember, are chemical signals in the blood, normally, and they target cells in the body and cause changes in them. They're secreted by the endocrine system, and they can be secreted by neurosecretory cells, but we won't be talking about that. So the endocrine cells release these hormones, typically into the blood. They pass through the body, going everywhere in the body, to target cells. The endocrine system includes a lot of glands, or hormone-secreting cells that work with the nervous system to regulate the body's activities. And if we compare the endocrine and nervous system, they operate as communication mechanisms. They're both communication mechanisms, but they act in very different ways. The nervous system is a very quick response, but short-lived, compared to the endocrine system, which is a slower response, but the response lasts for a longer time. So it's a different form of messaging depending on the need. If you need something to happen very quickly and in a short space of time, the effect doesn't need to last a very long time, then the nervous system is ideal for that. Something that takes a long time is going to need the signal to be out there for a long time, then a hormone is more appropriate. Hormones, water-soluble protein hormones such as epinephrine, which you might know as adrenaline, is received by receptor proteins. We talked about this in our cell signaling video. And then reload molecules as part of a signal transduction pathway will induce some kind of response. So epinephrine, one of the things that it can do is to convert glycogen into glucose. Okay, glycogen breakdown, providing sugar for the body. Think about the fact that if you have adrenaline, also known as epinephrine, in your body, something maybe you're scared, you need more sugar in order to provide the energy to escape or fight or whatever it is. There are also lipid soluble hormones such as testosterone. These are cholesterol based. Remember, cholesterol is also found in cell membranes regulating fluidity. These pass inside the cell because they can pass through the phospholipid bilayer to receptor proteins, and then they can induce a response, in this case, transcription. So you have a number of endocrine glands in your body, the thyroid, parathyroid, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's lots of different ones. We are going to just focus on the pituitary gland, which hangs down from the base of the brain. If you kind of put your fingers on either side of your head, like this, and like this, that's where your pituitary gland is. It's where those points would meet right in the center of your head. It has two parts, the posterior and anterior pituitary, depending on front and back. And we're just going to look very briefly at one of the things that the posterior pituitary releases, and that's the hormone ADH, also known as antidiuretic hormone. That hormone is released into the kidney tubules, and you're thinking of you may have heard of a diuretic before. A diuretic is something that causes you to pee more. So antidiuretic hormone is a hormone that is going to enable your body to conserve, to keep more water. In other words, to reabsorb more water from the kidneys. So if we look back here, this is going to have a big impact on the collecting ducts in particular. And so this next slide I'm going to show you focuses really on the right-hand side of a collecting duct. So here it is. Here's our blood plasma. Now the pituitary gland has detected that the body does not have, the osmotic concentration is going too negative. There is not enough water present in the blood, and so the body needs to conserve more water. So the antidiuretic hormone passes through the bloodstream to the antidiuretic hormone receptor on the surface of the cell. This should be sounding familiar to you because it's a cell signal pathway, a classic one, and a really nice example if you're looking for a specific example in perhaps an AP essay question. The ADH receptor is a G-linked receptor. Oops. It's a G-linked receptor, and so it activates the G protein, which activates adenylate cyclase and causes ATP to be converted into cyclic AMP. Remember, that's one of the secondary messages in a cell signal pathway. I think this is awesome because it's such a great example for you guys. The cyclic AMP then activates a protein kinase. Remember, protein kinase is the stuff that gets things done in a lot of cells by, think kinetic energy, by phosphorylating other molecules. In this case, the protein kinase A, causes these vesicles containing a large number of aquaporins to move to the outer cell, surface of the cell. Now, on the left-hand side, we've got the tubule, okay, that's collecting the urine as it passes out of the body. By putting more aquaporins in the outer membrane, we're increasing the amount of water that can flow into the cell. Remember, water can cross the phospholipid bilayer, but it's very slow. Aquaporins speed up this process. So having a large number of aquaporins in the cell surface membrane is going to cause more water to flow back into the cell. And we can have more aquaporins on the inner surface of the cell, causing that water to be reabsorbed back into the blood and ultimately maintain homeostasis. As I say, this is a great example. If you have any extra time today, learn this, draw it out again, draw it out again. It's a great cell signal pathway, and it's one that they could ask you about in the AP.